Welcome to my presentation on neurotransmitters. The first question you might be asking is what actually are neurotransmitters? And neurotransmitters are basically chemical messengers that transmit signals across synapses between neurons in your brain, and they regulate mood, cognition, and bodily functions. How do they work? So, the actual process of neurotransmitters working is very complicated, but it can be broken down into four main steps. The first is signal initiation. So, when a neuron receives a signal, it generates an electrical impulse that travels down the neuron to something called the axon terminal. Um, and there, neurotransmitter release happens. So when the electrical signal reaches the axon terminal, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters that are stored in these tiny little sacs in the neuron called vesicles, which are the circles with like a bunch of green circles in them. And these neurotransmitters are released into something called the synaptic cleft, which is the small gap in between neurons. Next is receptor binding. So this is when neurotransmitters cross the synaptic cleft and bind to specific receptors on the surface of something called the postsynaptic neuron or the one receiving the signal. And this binding can either excite or inhibit the receiving neuron, influencing whether or not it will generate its own electrical signal. Next is signal termination. So after the neurotransmitters have conveyed their message, they're removed from the synaptic cleft to prevent continuous stimulation. And this is achieved through reuptake into the presynaptic neuron or enzymatic degradation, which is where enzymes come and break down the neurotransmitter. And these functions were kind of proven during a case study, which used a special type of microscope to visualize neurotransmitters like dopamine inside of cells and demonstrated a 20 to 50% decrease in neurotransmitter levels inside cells after they first take action, which shows that some sort of termination process exists. The case study overall helps us understand a little bit more about how neurotransmitters function in the brain, which is crucial for studying neurological conditions. To tie it back into chemistry, it's important to understand how the molecular structures of different neurotransmitters affect their function. And the main way they do that is through what kinds of receptors they bind to. The shape and chemical structures of neurotransmitters determine which receptors it binds to on the actual receiving neuron. And we'll go into this a little bit more when I talk about specific types of neurotransmitters. So, I'm going to talk about kind of the three most well-known neurotransmitters, starting with dopamine. This is kind of the motivation pleasure neurotransmitter, and it has something called the catechol group, which is basically the hexagon of carbons with two hydroxides attached to it. And this allows it to bind to specific dopamine receptors where it influences pleasure pathways. The next is serotonin, which regulates mood, sleep cycles, and appetite. And it has something called the hydroxyl group, which is basically the hydroxide attached to the ring, which allows it to bind effectively to specific serotonin receptors in the brain. And lastly, the most well-known one is probably epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, which is known for preparing the body for fight or flight situations in times of stress. And because of its important function, it needs to act very rapidly. So to do this, it has two different groups that allows it to bind to two different types of receptors, making its effects more rapid. These two groups are called the catechol and amine groups. The catechol group is the same one in dopamine. It's the hexagon of carbons with two hydroxides, while the amine group is on the right side of the diagram, and it's basically the nitrogen bonded to one or more nitrogens. So the key takeaway from this presentation is that the molecular structures of different neurotransmitters play a huge role in their functions, especially through the different neurotransmitter receptors that they bind to. Thank you.